Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode of Talking TWAMPs, where we're recording out of Northern Virginia, specifically out of my sunroom, so it's a good time. But before we get too far into it, let's introduce ourselves. Jacob?
My name is Jacob Cordes. I've gone into the Lion's Den. I'm in, Northern Virginia, man.
And my name is Blake Phillips, and if this is the Lion's Den, I suppose that makes me an endangered species. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, the capybara, maybe.
And I am William Moore. I'm not sure how to take all that, because apparently this is the Lion's Den. I assume it's Northern Virginia, though. Although you're staying in Maryland, so don't give me that. That's
Maryland.
I'll
have that idea on the record.
Wholeheartedly agree with you. I would not be in Maryland either if I could help it.
Okay, well, today we are discussing an update to specifically the Cuban Constitution, which has changed a lot of things. It's been making waves throughout the international spectrum, notably for talking about how they're not going to be communist anymore, they're going to be socialist. But Jacob has some points to make on that. However, a lot of people are focusing on these more economic sides to it. However, there are 87 new articles to the Cuban Constitution, which originally only had about 140. So the Constitution is massively increasing in size.
Far too many, if you ask me. I think that all you need is, 7 articles in any given Constitution? I think that about settles it.
Because, of course, we've never had any problems with ambiguity or interpretation in our Constitution.
Not in the slightest.
No.
What are you talking about?
Never. But, so that's just a quick introduction to what's going on. It was proposed by the now ex-president, Raul Castro, and the new president is spearheading this change to the Cuban Constitution. Is this constitutional change meaningful, or are we all getting too worked up over nothing, gentlemen?
It's meaningful, but not in the sense that a lot of the news outlets have been emphasizing. The move from aiming to build communism to aiming to build socialism is a wordplay. It doesn't matter. It makes it more palatable to the world stage. What is meaningful is that Raul Castro is not dead, and he is no longer president of Cuba. It would be a stretch to call it a democratic transition of power, but it is at least no longer dictatorial, which I think, pretty nice change if you ask me.
I mean, I'm not terribly familiar with how the situation is in Cuba right now, but how is it less dictatorial than it was? Because wouldn't that be a slow transition from how Fidel ran the country to his brother? Because I seem to remember his brother was being a little bit less just shoot everyone on sight.
Yeah, so when you're talking about rule of law and stuff like that, it remains to be seen how the new constitution is going to be enforced and whether it's going to have any effect on making the justice system in Cuba more transparent. But I think from a political perspective, the important difference that we're looking at is that there is now a term limit for presidents, which means that someone like Raul Castro, who has been in charge for quite a while, there's no longer going to be that kind of concentration of power, and it actually looks like power is going to pass fully out of the hands of the Castro family. Now, that doesn't mean that the Communist Party of Cuba is going to loosen their grip to a considerable degree, but it is going to force more openness, at least among the party members themselves, and hopefully that snowballs and leads to true openness in their democratic process.
But to your enforcement question, William, I think one of the other meaningful reforms as a part of this overall constitutional reform is the creation of the prime ministerial position. This idea that the president, who under, of course, the original creation of Fidel Castro, the strong-arm dictator that we knew him to be, held basically all the power, be it judicial or they had a sort of a sham parliament, but much as we expect out of any pseudo-communist dictatorship. But now that there's going to be a prime minister who's going to hold a decent portion of the reins of power, that may force a little bit more of that democratic transition that Jacob was hinting at, because you're going to have 2 executives who can then sort of bandy back and forth in terms of power play, and they can have their own ambitions and motives, and then politicians can pick which of the two executives they are siding with.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about it in terms of political systems, Cuba up until this point has been a presidential dictatorship. Now we're looking at something more along the lines of an oligarchy, without the displays of wealth that are normally kind of associated with that. Not full democracy, but there are going to be competing political factions now, which is something that has been brutally repressed by the Castro regime up until this point.
Even if those factions are party internal.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I have to wonder now with this display of now two different positions, two different potential poles of authority that are both independent of each other. You have the president and the prime minister. Is this going to actually hurt the Communist Party of Cuba's position inside of Cuba? Because usually when you have such a monolithic government, if you have any kind of disruption at the head, it starts to fall apart. We had issues of that to a certain extent in China before Xi Jinping truly came to power, before he was really solidified. China was internally facing a lot of problems with its political system because it had different sets of people who followed different rules. So I'm curious to see if that'll disrupt Cuba internally.
I think that Cuba may prove a somewhat geographical and historical exception to that. What I would agree may be a larger rule. I think it helps that we've pulled just about everybody who might be considered a dissident in terms of communist rule out of the country by accepting any and all Cuban refugees. So just about anybody who was ever angry at the fact that they were socialist, communist, whatever we're going to call it, has left. So if there was going to be a revolution or anything violent in terms of uprising, I think that time period has pretty well passed. I think that the Cuban people, as they stand now, are decently unified behind this idea of a government. And I think that we often overlook as Americans who are kind of traded this narrative of life in Cuba is awful, that they're not living as well as they could be, but they're also not dying. They have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. Their economy is in kind of a shambles. They do still have a raging black market economy, but the black market economy is so poorly clamped down on that most people are willing to live within it pretty well. So I think that ultimately speaking, if we see political struggle, it won't come from the electorate or a push from the people. If anything, it would just come from ambitious party members who see this no longer a Castro regime as a vacuum to be filled.
Yeah. Certainly Blake is right that the potential for popular resistance to the new regime is, even if there's going to be a regime in the first place, is virtually non-existent. There's really no chance of that right now. We could see it develop in the future. Nothing is predictable, but right now the popular political situation is stable. Internally, however, I think the example of China was kind of prescient. In that, in the vacuum after Mao, there were certainly competing factions within the Communist Party. And we might see the same thing in Cuba. Now, what those factions are going to be, whether it's old guard versus new guard, internationalists versus isolationists, is yet to be seen. But I think what's important to us, thinking from an American policy perspective, is the U.S. Foreign Service going to be ready to exploit those divisions? Are we going to be ready to approach the Cuban government with a deal to help shore up their domestic position? And the answer right now is no. We don't have the diplomatic staff to do that, and we don't have the diplomatic connections to Cuba to do that. So for the time being, this is probably a moot point. It's an opportunity that's, in my opinion at least, from what I see, going to be wasted.
See, I disagree with the idea that China is the most prescient example in this case, though. I think that, if anything, we're looking much more closely at a parallel with the fall of the USSR, especially in structure. We're seeing, if not entirely meaningful, tactful changes in economic structure. We're seeing an interestingly new forming vacuum of power into a dual head of state system in which both positions have none to an amount of power that cannot be overlooked. Both the presidency and the prime ministerial position will be something that are important to hold for anybody seeking power. And what I reflect on, at least, is that in Russia at the time led to a decent power struggle for about 10 years before somebody took advantage of that and weakened the other position to the point at which it just became sort of a puppet swap position. And it made,
are we talking about the Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union Russia?
So post-Soviet Union Russia.
Okay.
So they've made a switch that is not really. It doesn't make a lot of economic. It doesn't have a lot of economic meaning to it. But they have said no longer communism, now socialism. They formally recognize the idea of private property. There is an idea that if they were to start selling off government property, there are a couple of people who are positioned well enough they could become oligarchic pretty quick. And my concern mirrors Jacob's, but not in terms of a Chinese example, but in terms of a Russian example.
I think what Blake is dancing around here is a name that we're all incredibly familiar with, which is Vladimir Putin.
Oh, God.
And it's a lower risk. It's certainly a lower risk. It's not as if Cuba is a nuclear capable country. It's not as if Cuba is, has borders with weak countries that they're looking to re-swallow. My one concern is that a dictator, if they were to rise in the way that in the way that Putin has risen, by exploiting a system, making it look like it's theoretically a democracy, while in reality it's a unitary party system, might make that sort of dictator reach out to other like-minded dictators, not unlike Putin. And one of the biggest risks during the Cold War was that we had Cuba right on our doorstep, with Russia able to access it for weapons caches. Right now, over the past 20 or 30 years, Cuba and Russia have had their differences to the point at which that's not really been a risk. But if a new dictatorship regime were to take over in Cuba, not even just with respect to Russia, with respect to anybody, what if China got a military base in the Caribbean? What if any one of any country, Venezuela even, who maintain very, very strong ties with Cuba,
right.
What if they were to get a strategic position in the Caribbean because a dictator who was looking to uphold a farcical democratic government looked for that international support?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. Not in the near future, like you said, but down
10,
the road.
20 years.
Cuban Missile Crisis Part 2.
But the one difference I'd like to bring up with the parallel with Russia is the USSR was not a national state, and that was a big part of what led to the instability in the USSR. Were nationalist movements in the Soviet satellites. Cuba, obviously, there's no risk of that. The Cuban island has developed a very strong national identity since the imposition of the U.S. embargo in the 50s, 60s,
60s, yeah.
And I think that with that source of instability eliminated, we're more likely, at least, to see a peaceful transition to a semi-democratic state, along the lines of, I'm trying to think of Mexico, for instance, in the beginning of the 20th century, their transition from a presidential dictatorship to a democracy. Now, obviously, that's run into its own problems in more recent years.
They have little to do with the government transition. Right. I still, though, I would contend that what it hinges on is not the national satellite issue, because, Putin and the anti-democratic rise that we saw there, theoretically was based on nationalist cells within the country. But I think we've got pretty decent evidence now that the quote-unquote Chechen attack on Moscow was staged, that it didn't take much. All they needed was somebody to pin it on for somebody to rise.
They just needed a reason.
Exactly. I think what's going to be key are two things. One, and this comes back to Jacob's point about our State Department not being ready to take care of this. One of the key things will be whether or not there is a democratic anybody who's willing to step in and sort of guide the transition. It doesn't have to be us, although oftentimes it is. It could be Britain, it could be France. Most of Europe has a better connection to Cuba than we do. A lot of them have reopened trade to some extent. So it may be that an EU country plays a little bit of a better role in guiding that democracy, and that would help. The second thing that will influence whether or not this goes south in 10 or 20 years will be whether or not there is an ambitious political player waiting in the wings in Cuba. Even before the real transition in the USSR, Putin had positioned himself in sort of a likely candidate position to take power in some way. I don't know enough about Cuba to see whether or not that's the case, whether there is somebody waiting in the wings to wait for a weak presidency to take their chance. But I mean, it's a country, right? There's got to be at least one politically ambitious, ruthless person there. And we'll have to watch to see whether that person comes to the fore.
Now, one thing that I would like to say is that unlike the Russia parallel, and I hate that we keep coming back to it, is Raul Castro, though he has stepped down as president of Cuba, is not irrelevant to Cuban politics. Now, he remains general secretary of the Communist Party. And so I think, following from that kind of incomplete withdrawal from political life on the part of Raul Castro, obviously he's reaching the end of his life. He's not going to be politically relevant for that many more years. The man can only live so long. But that the real focus of power, much as in China, is going to remain in the hands of the secretary of the Communist Party and not in the formal political structure.
That may provide the stability that it needs, though, because with many countries that have a hard transition from dictatorship to democracy, it usually falls apart just because the structural norms of having a democracy aren't there yet. And that would be my biggest concern with a Cuban democracy. If you're saying like a player who comes up, there's no concept. I don't know actually how strong the concept is in Cuba, but if they're building on the legacy of Fidel Castro, there's no concept of like having multiple people really be in power. It's the concept of the one-man show. So having this transition to democracy and having Raul Castro continue to be politically relevant and kind of continue helping this process that he's started forward, but not being the face of it anymore, might actually be the stabilizing factor this whole system needs in order to actually start to institutionalize these norms of the prime minister being a politically relevant role, actual discussion in the parliament of what the hell is going on, and even a few other things. They said like the creation of a presumption of innocence in their justice system. That's a big deal if you think about it in terms of how a country functions.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right, and that probably is the intent behind Raul Castro remaining as general secretary for the time being. I don't know if it remains to be seen. Of course, there is the chance that this isn't an honest reform at all, that this is a lateral move. And I think this is something that in the kind of media frenzy hasn't really been given much consideration. The media wants this to be a kind of extreme event, but there's a chance that this is just a recentering of power around the Communist Party formally, with Raul Castro remaining only as general secretary, and that there will be no real reform. And I think that is, I don't have any evidence to support that is the path that they're going down. But given the closed nature of Cuban politics, it's completely possible that this is just a recentering of the center of power. It's not opening up at all.
And the cynicist in me really wanted to believe that when I first saw this news break. But the more I look into it, the more I can't prove that it's not what's happening. I'm having a hard time figuring out why they would do it now. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, the only thing that I can come up with is that Raul Castro is aging and that the party wanted to center the government more around itself than the Castro family. And so this government reform was an opportunity to change but reaffirm the centrality of the Communist Party. Maybe. That was all I could come up with. But there's so much evidence, or not evidence, but there's so very little evidence to prove why now. I mean, of all the countries that President Trump is putting pressure on to reform, Cuba is not one of them.
Surprisingly, yeah.
He's mentioned it, but it's not his, North Korea, the EU, NATO, all of these things are getting his heat right now. Cuba is not. the EU has not really publicly, at least, expressed any interest in getting even more open with Cuba, and that these sorts of things were required before they would do that. If anything, this pushes them further away from Venezuela, who's been their closest regional partner and their only real sense of security, which isn't much now that Venezuela's government is collapsing, but it's not like these reforms insulate them from Venezuela's downfall.
Right.
I don't see why now, unless there's an actual sense in the party that reform is a good idea.
And I don't really have a good, complete explanation of why it would be. I'm a little bit playing devil's advocate, but I also think it's a real possibility. And one thing I would like to propose as a hypothetical situation would be that there is some popular unrest, not in regards to Cuba's socialist system, which, as far as we understand from our limited information, is actually quite popular with the people of Cuba, but rather with methods of political representation. There have been demands in Cuba, for instance, for wider membership in the Communist Party itself. And my kind of idea, a hypothetical reason for doing this would be that allowing the president and the prime minister positions to open up, they're now term limited, they're now going to have a wider participation in elections, means that it will be a kind of outlet for any potential popular unrest, while the true center of power remains with the Communist Party, where membership is controlled.
Yeah, I guess I'm extremely surprised that just about anybody in this day and age has that much political foresight.
Yeah, no, and it's kind of an outside chance, but if it happens, I want it to be on record that I guessed
that you called it,
and let the record state that you did. And I guess, I mean, as much as Americans hate to admit this, the political movements in Cuba, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, have been decently well thought out. And I may not agree with the way that they've set up their economic system, or what Raul Castro did, especially in the 70s and 80s, to cleanse the country of dissenters. But a lot of modern reforms do seem to have a tinge of actual planning to them, which is, again, super foreign to a lot of governments in this day and age, sadly.
Well, right. I mean, since the late 90s, or the early 90s, sorry, Cuba hasn't had, its big brother standing behind it waving a stick. They've had to learn to be very, very, very careful not to get stepped on.
Not even getting stepped on by foreign powers, getting stepped on by their own people. You have to start to manage the country correctly, otherwise you're going to have a real problem. I mean, we can look at China for a potential example. When they started really ramping up their economic system to compete on the national scale, and their people started to get a hell of a lot happier about it.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'd like to circle back to...
Yes, now they are.
is Blake touched on trade with the EU and economic reforms. And the second line in most of the news articles that I've seen after the move from communism to socialism, which, as we have discussed, really doesn't mean anything, was the introduction of private property. And I think this was shoved into kind of the third paragraph of most of these stories, but it was the introduction of private property and increased regulations on legitimate businesses in Cuba, legitimate private market businesses in Cuba. So I really haven't,
it's like a step. It's a step forward towards a free market, but also a bit of a step back.
Yeah. So this is what really, really clued me in to this feeling like a Russia parallel or a USSR downfall parallel. This sort of weird two-sided coin of, we'll recognize private business, but we're also about to get a lot harsher on business. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a couple of the articles have talked about they've begun re-waving the stick of seizure, of property seizure, which again looks a lot like in the 90s when the government in Russia seized a lot of property as the USSR fell, and then sold it all in huge lots, mm-hmm. which created the oligarchs that we know and hate today. So again, I think it'll be really interesting to watch Are they just seizing small things? Are they genuinely attempting to enforce socialism by piecemeal seizing small businesses that aren't complying? Mm-hmm. Or are they seizing huge lots of land from farmers and selling them off at, penny prices to government officials? What is this seizure being used to do?
Yeah, and I think obviously this is something we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But my impression from the articles I've read is that the regulations are primarily targeted at what kinds of what kinds of capitalism people can engage in, essentially, what you can speculate on, what you can invest in. And it doesn't strike me particularly as the prelude to mass seizures. If it is the prelude to mass seizures, it's a horribly planned out one. They're targeting relatively low value, relatively high value businesses that do a lot of trade, but ones for which the assets, were they to be seized, would be a storefront, and maybe a little bit of inventory. And so that at least leads me to believe that we're not looking at the prelude to a seizure. We're looking at an honest attempt, and maybe not effective, maybe not successful, but an honest attempt to enforce a vision of socialism. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I mean, interesting if it worked. Even a capitalist system needs a little bit more regulation than we've been giving it now in terms of investment and where we can put our money. But I know that one of the things you're talking about, these high lucrative storefront businesses, that is what is already suffering the most in Cuba. If we were to talk about an economic sector that has been hurt the most by Cuba, it is the day-to-day commodities market, which is why the black market is so huge. So I think even then, if it's not the prelude to a series of high-value asset seizures, then at the very least, they need to be very, very careful about harming what is already a tenuous legal commodities market by restricting it even further.
Yeah, and I don't think the Communist Party of Cuba is thinking, at least not primarily in the way we're used to, in terms of macroeconomic growth.
But even just, citizens having their own day-to-day needs, like that is the one thing that we could genuinely say suffers under their government. So not the one thing, one of the things that we could genuinely say suffers under their economic system.
And I think that's a really good point, and it's one of the reasons that the Communist Party has been willing to tolerate the black market to the extent that it has, because they have, through their own policies, destroyed that commodities market. But I think when we're talking about the political moves of the Communist Party, they're not as concerned with, say, GDP or trade, international trade, as we are. And we tend to forget about that because of the economy that we live in. But GDP as an indicator in Cuba probably just isn't that meaningful either to the government or to the citizens.
No, fully agreed. And even GDP per capita or income, I doubt really much matters to them. But I know for a fact we have a lot of really clear anecdotes of people getting a decent education and becoming taxi cab drivers because tips are worth. They're not greedy in terms of needing money to be in a higher social status, but there is really a dearth of toilet paper, of paper towel rolls, of just lunch meats, stuff that they need to get by on a daily basis. And I wonder if any of these economic reforms are going to have any meaningful impact on that commodities market, or because even if they don't care about GDP per capita or economic macros, flow or something like that, if you're going to be a system that espouses providing for your people, a socialist market that keeps everybody happy and fed, the fact that you cannot provide basic necessities to your people is not a great indicator.
Yeah, and I do kind of wish that the Cuban government engaged more in public, justifications for its policies, because I'd really like to see what their thinking was in implementing these reforms. I mean, we call them reforms, but in this specific case, in implementing these new regulations. Because certainly they have to know that their political stability rests on being able to provide basic goods and services. And so the question is, what is their end game with these policies? And we don't know because they don't put out public press releases.
Yeah, nor do we even really know what the concerns are that they could even be trying to address. We just have so very little data coming out of that country.
The fact that we just don't know. The fact that we just don't know. Okay. Well, I'm shocked by their whole creation of a free market thing, because I haven't read thoroughly into it, but this doesn't mean that they're really intending to engage in true international trade, are they? They're still going to be incredibly protectionist at the end of the day.
So that's the other thing that's kind of interesting. I forget how many classifications of property there are, but they don't line up with one another very closely. There's what you would assume sort of like public property, like what the government owns and what we all collectively own, that sort of belongs to a communist socialist system. But then there's also farmers' property, which is it's not private property, and it's not public property, and it can only be agricultural, which doesn't match the same classification as like public property because it sections off a subset of the population. And then there's joint cooperative owned property, which is not government owned but owned by several people and can be run like a private venture but democratically. It's all very strange, and the classifications of property have never really been super meaningful outside of how you're able to purchase them and sell them.
Right.
So that's what I'm interested in as far as this new private property classification. If I own private property, first of all, can that be land, or is it only movable commodities? Or the other way around, is it only land and not movable commodities? And then how does that affect my ability to sell them? And I think that's going to be key for this economy, because one of the biggest isolationist policies of Cuba is that no foreign national up until this point has been able to own Cuban land.
Right, they all lease.
Exactly. Is that now going to be a possibility? And if that's the case, that may be a sign that they're opening up to foreign investment, because then EU businesses, for example, could buy a plot of Cuban land and open a hotel or begin farming sugarcane, or maybe even something like a Bacardi factory could reopen. What does... Yeah,
as I look at the bottle of Bacardi behind William's head.
As we do.
So what is, what is that? What does private property mean effectively to the Cuban government?
Well, as to your point about international trade, William, I think... my impression, and I'm sure our listeners will correct us if we're wrong, but my impression was that that they were looking to increase the volume of international trade to see exports flowing out of Cuba and to import things, especially from the United States, importing agricultural products to drive down the price of food, but that they would not be permitting individuals, either Cuban or foreign, to directly engage in trade in Cuba. That essentially, if you want to do business in Cuba, you're doing business with the Cuban government.
You mean do business in or out of Cuba?
Into or out of Cuba. You're doing it with the Cuban government.
But not meaningfully between perhaps Cuban nationals.
Right.
You wouldn't have to go through the government.
So there isn't, for instance, going to be a Bacardi company of Cuba. There's going to be the Cuban government. And if they choose to produce rum, they'll sell it to you. And if you want to, say, sell bread to Cuba, you're going to sell it to the Cuban government for them to do with as they see fit. That's my impression.
So you still don't see this private property meaning that you have free, full range of your private property.
Right. Internally to Cuba, it may be different, but between Cuba and other nations, I think the Cuban government is going to be very careful to regulate the flow of goods and capital.
Yeah, which would again tie back into that supposition that we've had of basic status quo with maybe just sort of a waters testing of what does private property look like in Cuba.
Yeah, and I mean, at least for the Cuban government, that would make sense to do, because they've been a country that's been nominally self-sustaining to the best of their ability, or trading with relatively few partners. And even if you have to trade with the government, that still gives them amazing regulation over what the market can actually sell inside of their country, because they can just say, you know what, we're not going to do that. It also isolates Cuba somewhat from the effects of any rises or falls in the international market. So there may be a slight benefit in their perception to them of having that isolation. At least that would be my guess.
And that's a strategy that China has employed too, less successfully because of the size of their economy, and their increasing embrace of free enterprise. But China really does kind of tightly control the value both of its currency and of industrial commodities flowing in and out. And I think Cuba is going to be more successful than China if they choose to pursue that.
And so I think that's what's really interesting about the difference between China and Cuba. China eventually realized that just because of the sheer size of its country, its population, its economy, and the fact that it bears a land border with so many other countries, they had to engage in the world market on a very active level. I think Cuba may eventually prove that sort of case study of if you could take an island and implant a socialist government, would it work? Because it's impossible for us, or not impossible, but very, very hard to foment insurrection, to land troops, to really make those small targeted attacks on the governmental stability that we were able to do along the long Russian border or along the Chinese border or at the many Chinese open seaports. The Cuban government has much less land, much smaller population, and much less economy to handle and to keep secure. It may be the only country that we ever see really pull off a sort of contained, happy populace in a very weird socialist setting.
Well, that would certainly be something. I think that runs us out of time too, gents. So I think this was a very good talk. Any final thoughts on this new constitution? Because it technically isn't in effect yet. The national referendum is tomorrow, I think, right? The 23rd? Yeah.
How about it? What timing?
Yeah. Well, we dated ourselves there a little bit. But there's a few other not minor things. They are pretty important constitutional amendments. But the big one is the ending a banning of discrimination, which is interesting. I didn't realize that Cuba had that.
The legalization of gay marriage.
Yeah, and that is all actually Raul Castro's niece, another Castro, very prominent in the administration.
Yeah, whose husband may end up taking one of the two positions.
Right, but she has been kind of the champion of this. I don't know, the social reforms are also there, and they're pretty progressive for Latin America.
We'll have to see if they actually implement them in full. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Talking TWAMPs. I'm going to cut off here so that Jacob can't possibly do a...
So, if you enjoyed this episode of Talking TWAMPs, I encourage you also to go and check out our other shows on the podcasting network at William and Mary. A lot of really great content. You can find them on our Spreaker site or wherever you get your podcasts.
Indeed.
Thanks, guys.
Yep, thanks.